demographics are going in the wrong direction. Fertility rates are declining everywhere in the world. You've got older populations unsupported by younger folks in places like the UK, like the US, even places like China and Japan. And the point I want to make is the countries that can figure this out,
Exactly.
that can figure out how to attract people, how to integrate them, how to use them successfully and make lives better for everyone, those are countries that are going to have a tremendous geopolitical advantage.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm John Fowler, the CEO and co-founder of International Intrigue and a former diplomat in Beijing and Shanghai. With me, as always, is Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Geopolitical Analysis over at Cognitive Investments. Jacob, are you well?
I'm doing pretty well, trying not to melt in the heat that is the New Orleans swamp this summer.
Oh, I bet. And the viewers on our YouTube channel can see Jacob's wearing a very summery, flowery shirt, which I approve of. Looks good. So it's a good vibe for the end of the week.
Thank you.
This week, we're starting in Russia, which has had a ton of things going on, just generally, but particularly this week. They bounced right off the largest prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War with America to dealing with a ground invasion, it looks like, and other attacks from Ukraine. We'll also cover some updates in Bangladesh. I think a story that has been covered, but a little bit undercovered by the mainstream media. And we'll also talk about the fairly shocking anti-immigration protests, riots. We'll discuss what we should be calling them in the UK as well. Jacob, why don't you kick us off with what you've been seeing in Russia and Ukraine?
Sounds good. John, I think it's easy to forget that arguably the biggest land war in Europe since World War II, with apologies to the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, continues unabated. And this week we saw a major development in that war with Ukrainian regulars invading Russia near the Kursk region. Now, I want to caution us here. The fog of war is real, and I don't trust any of the initial reports we've seen, which include everything from Russia mopping up a few hundred Ukrainian soldiers to battalion-sized movements 10 miles into Russia supported by drones and forcible surrender of Russian troops. But whatever the case is, one thing is clear. This is the first time that Ukrainian troops have gone beyond supporting local militia and actually invaded Russia themselves in this phase of the conflict. The objectives of the offensive are not clear. Ukrainian officials are not providing specifics. One Zelensky advisor did say, and I'll quote him here, "We have to push them back in some areas if we want to make those areas safe for us. We are creating this buffer zone," supporting the idea that Ukraine is trying to relieve pressure in areas like Donetsk, where Russia continues to make slow, grinding progress against Ukraine's defenses. And meanwhile, you also already mentioned that prisoner exchange. The U.S. and Russia conducted the largest prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War, which might have been all we talked about with Russia and Ukraine if it weren't for this Ukrainian invasion. I guess they didn't want to be upstaged. And it follows 6 months of multilateral negotiations. Russia and Belarus released 16 detainees. The Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan, I don't want to spoil his last name, so let's just call him Evan. My good friend Evan was released from his captivity, which is maybe why it's getting a lot of coverage there in general, but also a sign that apparently Russia and the United States can still talk to each other and can still do things together. So I have several thoughts of my own, but I want to give you first dibs. What do you make of all this, John?
Well, it's hard to know what to make of it because I think the point that you made at the very top about the fog of war is almost the key point. We've been following this for 2.5 years now. And, I think the key lesson of it all is that you read things on Twitter, you read things in various reports, you can't ever be sure what's going on. So I don't know why. An objective to me of why Ukraine would invade Russia is not clear to me. There is a nuclear power plant in the region. There are rail lines. There are other traditional strategic military objectives. But I have no idea if that's what they're going after. It doesn't make logical sense, but I'm not a military commander either. So perhaps the quote that you read out, the idea that that was a less defended area of the border. And if we can attack it successfully and give Russia something to think about, give Putin something to think about, then maybe it's worth doing that to take the focus off other areas. But I don't know. And as for the prisoner exchange, I think it took me a few days to figure out what was going on there. It struck me that Putin would have interests in trying to wait until potentially after President Trump was elected, if he's going to be elected in November, to kind of, have Trump owe him a favor. But I actually think the reality of that is that only a Democratic administration could have gotten that done because of the amount of third-party countries that were involved. Biden came out and announced afterwards that it took, 4 or 5, I think 3 or 4 different Eastern European countries to sort of agree to give up prisoners that they were holding, Germany obviously had to be involved as well. And I just wonder if they would have been as willing to play ball with President Trump. So perhaps it was a situation where Biden went to Putin and just said, listen, I can get these guys. You're not going to get Trump to get you those guys now or never. But what do you think?
Yeah, so I want to focus a little bit on the military aspect of this because, and I don't want to shit on the mainstream media all the time. Like the mainstream media is good at some of the things that it does, but I think one of the areas where it's truly weakest these days is in reporting on wars. Because you need people on the ground and you need experience doing these things. And the way that the media is covering this is it's, oh my God, Ukraine's invading Russia. Russia's on the back foot. Like Ukraine is pushing forward. And I don't see that as the case. I'm a Civil War nerd, as you can probably see by some of the stuff behind me. And the example I want to use here is that, if you were writing newspaper articles today about Robert E. Lee going up north into Pennsylvania, you might have this sort of breathless, oh my God, the South is invading the North sort of thing. But it was an act of desperation. It was, we have to show that we can still stay in the fight or to relieve pressure in these other places because otherwise we're screwed. And when you look at the gaps in materiel, when you look at the gaps in troops, when you look at the slow grinding progress that Russia's been able to make, all those things make me nervous. On the other hand, it is really embarrassing for Russia. And it's embarrassing that this continues to go on. We're on like day 2 or day 3. They didn't just mop it up. So I think it is a something, and Ukraine has had some progress. And maybe Ukraine's going to get fighter jets. And maybe they're expecting that they're going to get some more armaments from France and some of these other EU nations coming down the line. So they feel empowered to use some artillery and use some troops to say, no, we need to remind the Russians that there's a real enemy here. They can't just do what they want to do and expect that we're not going to push back. And the way I think this ties into the prisoner exchange, though, is, how worried should Ukraine be about the level of support they're going to get from the United States? Because it's not like the White House has been out full-throated support of what Ukraine has done. They're not criticizing it either. They're just sort of waiting and seeing. So is Ukraine thinking, we've got Biden, so we need to make a move now? Are they thinking, like maybe the U.S. isn't there and we have assurances behind the scenes from other European countries? I think in some ways that's the most important thing here. Why is Ukraine doing this, and what kind of support are they getting? And does this prisoner exchange suggest that European nations or the U.S. or both would rather deal with Russia pragmatically than support a Ukraine that is going off and invading parts of Russia without telling anyone ahead of time?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Let me ask you the other side of that. Rather than focusing on Ukraine, Russia, by all accounts, has lost a diesel-powered sub in Crimea. There are anti-air defenses that have been confirmed, taken out in Crimea, confirmed by the UK Ministry of Defence in a press release, which is about as official as we're going to get in this kind of war. Reports, again, reliable reports, that in May, Russia was losing about 1,400 soldiers a day. They've come down a bit to about 1,000 a day, but I think general estimates from, again, reliable sources suggest that Russia's losing about 1,000 troops a day, and that will continue for at least August and maybe into September. If we expand out and look back over 2.5 years of war, how long can Russia continue to do this, even if it doesn't change, even if it's this grinding stalemate? We focus on Ukraine, we focus on them not having support, but what about Russia? That's got to be taking a toll, right?
I think longer than you and I think. I had a Russian analyst friend on my podcast shortly after the war, and he hasn't responded to my emails since then, but he came on the podcast shortly after the war, and he said, Jacob, we're not going to stop just because you cut off our access to baguettes and fancy wine. Like, we are Russian. We can handle this stuff. Like, you Westerners are much weaker compared to us, which I think is part of the line there. Also, I thought maybe the Prigozhin stuff was the beginning of the end for the fall of the Russian regime. It wasn't. Things seem to be okay. And it's an interesting lead into our next topic, where you have a government that is falling apart. But I think the answer to your question is that Russia can last a lot longer than we think it can, because the standards of what passes for surviving in Russia is different than what passes in the West. And they have more people. Like, they are willing to outsuffer us until we're uninterested in the conflict. And if it's just Russia on Ukraine, Russia wins that war. So it's about Russia lasting longer than the West wants to pony up support for Ukraine. I think that the West will be there. I think Russia's making a mistake there, but I think Russia can do this for a long time before it collapses. I think that's what the Prigozhin incidents tells us.
Pivoting to our next story, which is Bangladesh, a country that I don't think we talk about very often, but is a very important country, an often overlooked country. And the cracks in the wall there really broke through well, it's a mixed metaphors. The dam broke last week. So what's happened is Sheikh Hasina, who has long time ruled that country, it's a democracy-ish. She was seen as kind of someone who had won 4 consecutive elections, but had stacked the deck in her favor. So had won elections, but not really necessarily free and fair elections. She had ruled with an increasing autocratic tendencies. She was run out of town last week after a couple of months of protests, starting with students. She literally got to the chopper, as Arnie would say, and chop it off to New Delhi, ending 20. She's been in charge of 20 of the last 30 years in Bangladesh. So it's pretty momentous, even in a vacuum, having a leader being forced from power by popular protests after that long in power. We'll get into what actually happened, but where we're at now is a Nobel Peace Laureate known as a banker to the poor, a guy called Muhammad Yunus. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, 2006 for creating a bank that served underbanked people, poor people in Dhaka. He's come back from exile to lead an interim government with the idea of having fresh elections. He's got the military support. He's got student-led protest support. So his goal is to kind of lead a transition government and hopefully get democracy back on the rails in Bangladesh. Very quickly, before I throw to you, these protests were really interesting to me because they started in June based on the resumption of an old rule that set aside government jobs for the families of folks who were involved in Bangladesh's War of Independence back in the 70s. So it sort of said, if you were related to anybody who fought that war, you get a government job. That caused a ton of protests, which closed schools, universities. The government responded, as autocracies often do, by strict curfews, a shoot-on-sight order, apparently I saw reported, which is very, very draconian. Restricted internet cell service. They got out the handbook and they did all those things, but it didn't work. So I've got a couple of questions for you. But the first one is, why now? What made her bow to the pressure and get out? I think that's becoming increasingly rare when you look at popular uprisings. And 2, do you see any warning signs for the region more broadly? She's in India now. India and Bangladesh potentially, they've been getting along great, but that would be a real problem if that changed. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm going to hit both of your questions, but the first thing I want to say is just, last week, I think I mentioned we had Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia. Now it's Bangladesh. Like, you're looking around emerging markets and the developing world, and there is a lot of economic, political pressure that we're seeing. So Bangladesh it came to a head in a particularly acute way, and we'll talk about that. But there is something happening in the developing world in general that Bangladesh, I think, is part of that story, and I don't want to lose that thread. In terms of what made her step down, she's a very interesting figure and comes from a very interesting family in her own right. So her father, ironically, was a student activist in the 1960s and 70s and became the father of the nation. He was the first prime minister of Bangladesh, is sort of seen as the George Washington of Bangladesh, if you will. That's not a perfect metaphor, but it works. And so I don't know that I would go as far as describing Bangladesh as an autocracy. She's popular. She was elected earlier in the late 90s, then left office, then came back. Certainly over the last 15 years in her consecutive premierships, she has been tightening the screws on the country. But as we've just seen in the last week, not quite tight enough. The other thing she's done in the last 15 years is that GDP per capita has gone up by 5 times. So she's been very economically successful in sort of getting a very, very impoverished nation, which is still really poor. We're still talking about GDP per capita less than countries like Lebanon and Honduras, even with the 5x increase in GDP per capita. But she's had some success. And the student protests were peaceful when they started. What's really strange to me is not that she decided to leave. I think she saw that the writing was on the wall. What was strange was exactly what you said, that she decided to deploy security forces to go after a peaceful protest that wasn't bothering anyone. And things only came to a head last week when something like 100 of these protesters were killed in one day. In July, about 200 people were killed in general. Not even that was enough to push things forward, but 100 died in one day. And she apparently, gathered, this is reporting from the New York Times, gathered the security advisors at the residence and said, go after them harder. I want to crush this movement. And the military basically said, even if we wanted to do that, there are hundreds of thousands of people streaming to Dhaka, the capital. We can't do that. You're done. And at one point, apparently, her son, who lives in Virginia, had to call her and impress upon her the gravity of the situation. And it was at that point that she decided to leave. So I think she saw the writing on the wall. I think the deeper question is, why did she resort to violence? And it's an unsatisfactory answer, but she's 76. This Nobel laureate they're putting in there is 84. Maybe your views got ossified. Maybe you're just isolated and you're drinking your own Kool-Aid. I mean, we'd have to get her on the psychologist's couch and ask her questions why she decided to go that route. But something there doesn't quite line up. I think you're also exactly right to think about the geopolitical intrigue here, if you will. I mean, we could spend an entire series of episodes just on the relationship between Bangladesh and Pakistan and India and all these other things. But to me, the really concerning thing is that the violence has gone from a student protest and protesters versus the government to ethnic violence. And in a Muslim majority country, they are now singling out Hindus in some of these attacks because the Hindus supported Hasina because she had a close relationship with India and was trying to use that relationship in order to push things forward. One of the most notable things I've seen in the reporting was, I don't know if you know this, I mean, 90% of Bangladesh's exports are garments. So if you're wearing this flowery shirt was actually made in China, but most stuff that you're wearing, you're probably going to get a lot of Bangladesh there. And I saw an Indian Garment Association that said, we don't like this. We're going to make all of our stuff in India for the next 6 months because we want to mitigate risk. That's a huge deal. If you're going to get even Indian companies are going to look at this situation and say, we're not going to stay here. Like, we're going to relocate the risk. That'll be even worse for the economy. And we could get into a spiral. So that's a lot. I mean, how do you see it from where you're sitting?
No, you're very right to push back on my lazy calling it an autocracy. I think it's something I dislike when other people do it, and I fell into that trap. I think we need a way to describe countries that are something less than fully free and fair, but something also less than autocratic regimes, kind of, like what I would describe Russia or something like that as. But I just find it, I mean, maybe it's having I didn't know the detail about having a son in Virginia. Maybe it's having a family member she trusts outside her bubble that convinced her to leave, because why would she leave when Bashar al-Assad, when so many other of these kinds of, and again, they're not analogous, but like so many of these kinds of leaders choose not to. They choose to fight. They hold themselves up and really surround themselves with military. It is still interesting to me that she went pretty peacefully. And I think we probably won't know why until the book is written in many, many years to come. But I mean, it's a good thing that it didn't get worse. And I think you're very right about the ethnic violence element. We've got Rakhine State on one side of Bangladesh, which has for years in Myanmar had problems. Myanmar still has problems. On the other side, you've got Modi, who loves to stoke nationalist sentiments in his country, and potentially has a reason to do so if Hindus are wanting to flee to India. So I think it's one to watch for sure.
We're going to shift to a conversation that may not seem related at first, but I actually think it is deeply related to what we just talked about, and I'll make that clear now. We're going to go to the United Kingdom, where we've had a series of violent anti-immigration protests that have swept through several major cities in England in recent days. We've seen vandalized buildings, cars burning in the streets, lots of very intense imagery of clashes between police and protesters going to different hotels and places where migrants or wannabe immigrants are usually housed, or actually banging on trucks that are taking immigrants from one place to the other. The protest began because there was a knife attack on a group of children at a Taylor Swift themed dance event, and 3 girls lost their lives, 6, 7, and 9 years old. I can tell you, as a father of a daughter now, those stories hit very differently for me now. So I can understand some of the unrest that we're seeing there in general. The perpetrator, it looks like, was not actually an immigrant himself. He was the son of immigrants, Rwandan parents, it looks like is what his parents were. But on Sunday, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer blamed far-right thuggery and vowed that he would bring all of these troublemakers to justice, and that 150 people have been arrested since things broke out. Things are starting to get a little bit quieter, but I wouldn't say it's quiet in general, and England still seems to be seething with some of this unrest. And there's a few data points I want to throw at you. The first is, immigration, migration in general. This has been the third rail of British politics. It's arguably why Brexit happens in the first place. If you don't get an uptick in migration around the time of the Brexit referendum, I'm not sure that Brexit actually goes through. Net migration in the UK, I was also surprised to learn, was unusually high in 2023. So they were at about the OECD average for most of the last 5 years, but they had almost 700,000 non-EU citizens coming into the UK last year. That's a big number for a country that is already skeptical about migration and is having its own, internal political problems and economic issues too. And then the way this ties into things like Bangladesh, and I took this data from the United Nations, at the end of 2023, we've got an estimated 117 million people worldwide have been forcibly displaced due to persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations. They're expecting that has already exceeded 120 million now. That's a rise of 8% compared to the end of 2022, and it continues a series of year-on-year increases over the last 12 years. 1 in every 69 people, or 1.5% of the entire world's population, is forcibly displaced, and that's nearly double what it was a decade ago. So we're at double the number of displaced persons, the people who are trying to immigrate into these countries, that we were a decade ago. And those people come from places like a Bangladesh that is burning, or Nigeria, where inflation is going out of control. So these things that are happening in these developing markets, they're also going to affect the politics in some of these more developed markets. Everything is connected. How do you think about these riots themselves? Because they were very striking to me, John.
I think you've set it up perfectly. I don't have a lot of comments on the riots themselves. I think one of the interesting things there is what do you call them? Certain, depending on your political persuasions, people have called them protests. I think that's not what they are. I think they are just opportunistic riots from folks who are, on one scale, bigots and racists, and on another scale, perhaps disassociated members of society who don't feel like they've got a stake in the future of their community, so are willing to burn the places down. But I don't want to get into that because that's a much more domestic political issue. They're horrific, is what they are. But I think you've nailed the causes right on the button. We've been doing this for a long time, respectively, in our careers, Jacob, and I couldn't pinpoint when this started, but I've been hearing about migration is the next big issue in the UK. I mean, it's been an issue in Europe for a while now. Climate change, conflict, even just economic migration, the unifying, globalizing power of social media, the ability to project, oh, look how good life is here, and you're on Instagram in Bangladesh or Algeria or wherever it is, the Arab Spring, all of these things mean that, and the relative ease of travel compared to 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. I'm not saying it's easy for these folks coming from all over the world, but the relative ease, this is one of the most predictable but slowest moving long-term trends in geopolitics, and it's not going away. And the lesson of the UK is, I think, again, not to be political, but they have done an awful job in developing policies that both acknowledge that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, that needs to be regulated, that needs to be managed, a process needs to be set out to manage it. And they've politicized it. The previous government did a very good job of politicizing it. These riots are awful, but a policy of housing asylum seekers and immigrants in hotels all around the country with no end date is an absurd policy on its face, regardless of your politics. So, and it's not just the UK, right? The US is having these issues. The US is a much bigger country, and so it's much more able to absorb those kinds of numbers, at least initially, and it's been happening for longer. But these things are happening everywhere. And Australia, my home country, we dealt with this in the 2000s, and we're still dealing with it now. We've got literally a moat, but this is going to keep happening. And I hate to say it, but I doubt this is going to be the last time we see violent riots happening about migration.
It's not, but I just want to spin it in a little bit more of a positive direction, because it can get kind of depressing if you just go too far down. Because you're right that the UK has done a particularly bad job from a policy perspective. The US has not done much better. But the flip side of this is, and this is another one of the tropes that we hear all the time, demographics are going in the wrong direction. Fertility rates are declining everywhere in the world. You've got older populations unsupported by younger folks in places like the UK, like the US, even places like China and Japan. And the point I want to make is the countries that can figure this out,
exactly,
that can figure out how to attract people, how to integrate them, how to use them successfully and make lives better for everyone, those are countries that are going to have a tremendous geopolitical advantage. Countries like China struggle with this mightily. Countries like the UK and the US have historically been better at doing this. One of the things I've been watching the last year or so is Japan is trying to do this. For the first time really in their history, they are trying to attract people from, whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia, the Philippines, and try and integrate them into society in a way that gives them young labor and gives those people sort of a chance. So if you're looking for who's going to succeed geopolitically over the next 5 to 10 years, it's countries that are able to articulate and enact policies to deal with this, because you're either going to deal with it and make it a positive for your country, or we're going to see what we've seen in the UK over the past week on steroids in multiple countries throughout the world.
Absolutely. And that means getting to the middle ground on this, right? I feel like too many on the left act like it's not a problem that needs to be dealt with at all. It's all about humanity and kind of giving people better lives, which it is. And the right, Elon Musk, stoking fears in the UK about, civil wars coming. The right say none. This has to stop. Otherwise, our country is not our country. And as you said, the people who can say, hey, this isn't, I think we need to put in a process to make this regulated. We need to make it sustainable, but we need immigration. Those are the countries, those are the political systems that I think will ultimately win. I couldn't agree more. Let's push on to our last story. So this is a section where we're trialing, which is the story that nobody cares about but should. We did it last week, where you so eloquently told us why we needed to care about what was going on in Central Africa and the Congo. Today it's my chance, and I'm going to talk very briefly about something closer to Australia, where I'm from, and that's a little island chain called Bougainville. It's part of Papua New Guinea, a country that is never talked about other than in Australia and New Zealand, and the region. But nearly 5 years ago, this tiny region, it's a little island chain which is closer to the Solomon Islands than it is to Papua New Guinea, for those of you who know the region. It voted for independence in a non-binding referendum. The backstory of Bougainville is that it has had a long history of secessionism. I bet they wouldn't even call it secessionism because they don't see themselves as naturally part of Papua New Guinea. There was a huge civil war when I was growing up. So I remember nightly news in Australia in the early 90s when I was young being like, like the war in Bougainville. It's a small island chain with not many people, but it was particularly brutal. Now, they signed a peace agreement in 2001, which was a real big deal in that part of the world. And it's held for 23 years and counting, which is no small achievement, as you know, when it comes to ethnic tensions. That is a remarkable achievement. But the Bougainvilleans still see themselves as an independent region. There's strong ethnic identities. There is a strong distaste for what they would call colonial interventions, which that region has had just about everybody have a go at it over history, including Australia, in a sort of more, maybe not colonial, but neo-colonial or whatever you want to call it, context. So the situation now is that after the referendum, which was 97% approved of, by the way, so it was not a close run thing. It wasn't a Brexit situation. They overwhelmingly want to be independent. There is a 5 or 6 year limit on negotiations to make that happen. It was non-binding, so now that it needs to be approved by the Papua New Guinean Parliament. And that's where the sticking point is. They're not moving on it. They can't agree to how to get it done. But 2027 is kind of the end of the road, in which I expect, if they haven't been granted their independence in a way that suits Papua New Guinea, they will, I imagine, declare unilateral independence. And I frankly don't see Papua New Guinea government approving independence for Papua New Guinea. So it's nothing to watch immediately, and there's no kind of news hook to it, but I think it's a story that no one knows about, but it's fascinating. It's a big deal for Australia because we have been seen as meddlers in the region, and we have to be very careful about how we, capacity build and support both sides without supporting either side. But yeah, it's an interesting story, I think.
You'll be happy to know that at Stratfor, which is where I was, my first job in geopolitics and where I was trained, we would always give the young analysts 2 countries to do a net assessment of as part of their training at the end of their training cycle: Spain and Papua New Guinea, because they were both ideally situated to try and create like geographic imperatives and understanding their development out of the geography. So there's at least a small subset of former Stratfor alum who are with you and who have been following this stuff for a long time. It also, though, it seems to me that it's actually part of a broader story, because when you look at a map of Australia and of New Zealand, you guys are surrounded by all of those different small island countries. These are the ones that MacArthur so geniusly island hopped his way to Japan with in the context of World War II, and are the only reason that Americans know any of these names: the Solomons, Samoa, Fiji, all that other kind of stuff. And it seems like all of these countries are having problems, like New Caledonia and France and all their nickel, like that's been a big thing. You alluded to the Solomons already, and there's concerns about China coming in here. If the Australians are seen as meddlers, is China going to come in and support one side or the other, or pick off these different security things? So it may sound like it's not that big of a deal, but I think you're exactly right to bring it up, because while I don't think we'll be talking about these types of countries on sort of international news in the next 5 years, I think 10 or 15 years from now, the way things are going, these countries are going to be in a really interesting position. And there's going to be a real market for people who actually know what's going on in these places, because they are critical geographically if you're thinking about the security of the Pacific and about Australia in general.
Absolutely. And I mean, it is a big deal for the Australian government. You know, my former employee, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Pacific Division is traditionally our largest division. It's kind of, we spend a lot of time, and I mean, it's our backyard. It's Australia's backyard. So, and this is, I think, a tension that many countries are going to face, sort of region. I don't want to call Australia a hegemon, but regional powers are going to struggle with this. I should say Western, or at least free democratic regional powers struggle with this idea of the real threat of unrest on your borders, the ability that you can control those things or at least influence events. But if you are seen to be doing that, you open yourself to charges of neocolonialism and play into the hands of places like China, like the autocrats who say, hey, it's about time that these colonials went back home. So for us, it's, I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of my former colleagues, but it's one of those situations where you have to be very careful to be seen to be constructive, to support folks, to support people, to be there when they need you, but to not be a heavy hand, which opens yourself up to kind of accusations of, as I said, neocolonialism. But anyway, fascinating, I think. Let's leave it there, Jacob. Thank you so much, as always, for joining me this week.
Cheers.
And we'll be back next week. Thanks, everybody.